today I was just going to talk a little bit about world building, because there's a subject I'm really interested in, and I read a book recently where there was some really good world building, and then I thought, well, actually, if there's a tag out there, I could just do the tag, and there's not a tag. So I thought, make a tag. Even if nobody does this tag, it's just a way for me to talk about world building, but if people do want to do the tag, then that's absolutely brilliant, and I would love to watch people's videos, so I present the book world building tag. I think world building is very important, no matter what book you're reading. For fantasy and sci-fi books, I think it's very, very important to set out the rules of the world you're in, because it's different from our world, so that when we are reading that book, we're inhabiting those characters, we kind of get a sense of where we are. Non-sci-fi, non-fantasy books still need an element of world building. If it's a historical book or a contemporary novel, we still need to know where we are, and most specifically, if we're talking about a protagonist, then we need to know the protagonist's surroundings. I recently read a couple of books in the Cadfael series, which are set in England, but 1,000 years ago, and that needs world building, because even though I know what England kind of looks like, the culture of that time and the way that people talk to each other and buildings and the general ambience of that time I needed described to me. Sometimes it's all well and good saying, oh, the protagonist went to school, they did this, they went home, but sometimes you need a bit more of an identity of where that place is, how the world works, the mechanics of the culture, whether it's in space, whether it's in the past, the future, no matter what, they can lay out the rules of the world. Because things can't just happen. If you're writing a book and someone just starts flying for no reason, you go, well, I don't really buy into it. It was actually one of my problems with The Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin, when he included magic, because until then it had been a very sort of realistic world, where yes, it was in a fantasy land, but all the plot elements were based in a reality that I could buy into. War, betrayal, deceit, political manoeuvrings, family trouble, these are all things we have in our world, and even though it's in a different place, in a historical sort of medieval setting, you can still buy into it. Then he included dragons, and again I bought into it because he'd set up, used to be around a lot, and then they kind of died out, now they're back. But then Melisandre comes along, and she's just doing magic, like actual magic, and at first I thought it was trickery, but no, it's magic. You haven't built a world where magic exists, and suddenly magic does, and I was just kind of turned off slightly. Don't know if people agree. If you do, don't, leave it in the comments. So even though I'm mostly going to be talking about fantasy and sci-fi, I really encourage people to think about non-fantasy, non-sci-fi things. You know, was there a book that you've read where there was amazing world building within our world in which we currently live? So I've got a couple of questions. I think they're generally quite generic. But first, I need some coffee. Question 1. Who, in your opinion, is the most detailed world builder? For me, it's a toss-up between Robert Jordan and J.R.R. Tolkien. J.R.R. Tolkien is like the king of world building. He wrote the Silmarillion because he was like, hey, you know Middle-earth? You know the hundreds, thousands of years of history that I didn't tell you about in The Lord of the Rings? Well, here it is. He loved Middle-earth so much, he started off expanding it geographically and then ended up expanding it historically. There's also Robert Jordan, who wrote the Wheel of Time series, and I'm a really big fan of that series. He also, I think, suffers a bit of Tolkienitis. He suffers also from Tolkienitis, in that he has created this huge world, and he keeps on building and building and building, which is impressive, but also can kind of bog down the book. Robert Jordan, though, I like it because it's not just the history and the geography, it's also the culture. He'll talk about what people are wearing, he'll talk about how the mood of a certain people is affected. He builds the world completely in a visual sense, but he also gives you an understanding of the people, of the cultures, and I think that's really, really good. Question 2. Name a detail or a thing which functioned only as a world-building tool in a book. For me, I'm going to choose the Avoxes in The Hunger Games. An Avox is a servant whose tongue has been cut out so they can't speak. Suzanne Collins could just as easily have written in a servant who just doesn't speak, but she mentions Avoxes and the specifics of an Avox for a certain reason, I think. The utter cruelty of Panem. Or insidious is that the people of Panem see nothing wrong with cutting out people's tongues. And I think that's really sinister, and that helps build this isolation that you feel as Katniss when you're in this place with totally alien cultural ideas. So the inclusion of an Avox, for me, in that book, really highlighted the cultural difference between Katniss and the residents of Panem. Question 3. Do you prefer well-described characters and an underdeveloped setting, or vice versa? So even though the setting is very important for me, and I really enjoy having details of a setting, of locations, of buildings, but well-developed characters are much more important. And I would much rather read a book where it says you're in a room, and it doesn't tell you anything about the room. Horrible though that is, I could bear it if the characters are really well developed, if they're described, if their clothes are described, if their face, their structure, how they stand. So as much detail about characters I love, and I prefer that to setting. Question 4. How much world building is too much world building? You can put too much effort into describing a world. If you're describing every little detail and everything a character does and how they move their arms, it stops you living in the moment of the book. And I think that's when world building is too much, when you stop thinking that you're there in the situation. Question 5. What book or series could benefit from more world building? This may be a controversial one, but it's A Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy by Douglas Adams. Because Douglas Adams had loads of really imaginative ideas. They're these little tiny things that he throws out at you, and they're all quite comical, and I think that's kind of the point. It's satirical, it's funny, he's playing with all these weird and funny ideas. There's no overarching world. He had the thing where if he could think of something funny or silly, he would throw it in. Question 6. Do you prefer the intricacies of the world to be presented early on or revealed throughout the book? So in my view, there's two ways to world build. Either you slowly find things out throughout the book as your character finds them out, and things are revealed to you so that you're not shocked at the start with the amount of information. This has its advantages and disadvantages. It's a lot easier to absorb, but it can lead to a lot of questions. The other option is to present as much world-building information at the start of the book as possible, possibly in a prologue or in the first chapter, saying this is how the world works. These are the nations, these are the people, these are the creatures that inhabit it. Also with its advantages and disadvantages. Advantage, you as the reader know everything about this world early on. When something happens later, you go, well, of course, because that's how the world works. Maybe it's a thing where children are selected and killed off to protect a gene pool. Maybe rabbits are the overseers of the universe. I find that the disadvantage of this overwhelms the advantage. The disadvantage being, it's too much. It's almost like you're reading about something in like a newspaper article. If your book is a high concept book, you need to push that concept quickly. You need people to get on board with that really early on. But at the same time, if you're giving too much information, it doesn't feel like you're reading a story anymore. So for me, I prefer for things to be revealed throughout the book. Question 7, and I ummed and ahed about this for a while, but draw or describe your perfect world. It's not going to be enough time to do that, but briefly, draw a map of or describe your perfect imaginary world, where if you were a writer, you would set your stories, or if you are a writer, where you are setting your stories. This could be a planet, it could be a land like Narnia, it could simply be a school or a town or a city, wherever you would build a world and write stories in this world. I drew a very colourful map. My perfect sort of imaginary world would be a kind of medieval, kind of Game of Thronesy kind of world with lots of like political stuff. I really like political stuff in books. So I'm going to show you my map. So unconventionally, I've drawn the middle of the map as being like a pole, so the middle is really, really cold, and everything then kind of comes out of that, like it's the South Pole or the North Pole of the planet. Because I'm tired of like reading books where on the map the North is cold, or the South is cold. It's a very North-South kind of divide, which we on planet Earth kind of naturally gravitate to. But what if it was different? What if life spread out from a pole? So I've got a polar region here, I've got a mountainous region here, and there's like a city in the middle of the mountains. It's between two mountains, and it like guards a pass. And then there's like a city here, Chicago-esque, giant, upon itself kind of city. And it's different to this city on the other side of the sea here, which is huge and grand and has guild halls and castles, and it's very rich. This place here would be like a religious nation. There's a city here between two rivers, because cities have to be like around rivers, don't they? And so there's rivers, you know, surrounding this one. I think a lot about infrastructure and geography when I'm thinking about worlds like this. You have to. If you think, oh, this is a great city, we've got to think, well, how do they get their water? Where does the food come from? Hence why I've drawn farms in orange. And if you want to travel to places, you kind of have to either brave going through this polar region, not very safe, or you have to take the long way round. A lot of fun drawing this. And I haven't thought about it before, but I was thinking, if I was to write a fantasy novel, what would the world be like? And I'm really interested in characters, and you get lots of characters in cities, so I focused on where my cities would be, because of all the political manoeuvring that would then go on. Like, the people here are generally quite coarse and rough, and they resent the people over here, but these guys, because they're safe in their castle, they're quite noble and high-minded, but also they don't care about the world, so they're quite cold and nobody really likes them. And I think this would be like mostly trade over here, but I think there'd be lots of like piratey kinds of things. Anyway, if you want to do this tag, please do, and like describe or draw a map of your fantasy land, no matter what it is, because it's all about just like world building, and some of you will already have these ideas, because some of you are writers or consider writing. Or your fantasy land has already been created. Maybe Narnia is your perfect fantasy land. Perhaps it's a planet. Perhaps it's a city or a town. Maybe it's Gotham City. Maybe it's Hogwarts. So if you do this tag, please let me know, because I'd love to see if people do this and if they enjoy it. So specifically I want to tag Katie Masters, Michael from Bitten by a Radioactive Book, Kitty G and the Booktube Couple, but if anyone is interested in this tag, please do it, send me a link. But otherwise, thank you very much for watching.